There are power men should never have trifled with. One that brought Valyria its doom.
When exactly does the history of Westeros and Essos start? Why do I ask this? Well, only because the Valyrian Freehold was a part of Essos, from where the Targaryens came and settled on Dragonstone. The Valyrian Peninsula is a large piece of headland that extends from the middle section of southern Essos and penetrates deep into the Summer Sea. The Valyrian Peninsula was also surrounded by a series of magnificent volcanoes called the 14 Flames, through which originated the fiercest creatures on the face of the earth, the dragons. Then came the Doom, and all was shattered to pieces. But let me remind you, the history of Valyria is anything but simple. It's riddled with blood magic, darkness, the shrieks of slaves, the glory of riches, the strength of fire, and much more. And in this video, we're going to explore everything I just spoke about in as great detail as is possible. So, without further ado, let's begin. But before that, please consider subscribing to us. It may be a small click from you, but for us, it means a lot. And now, let's continue.
Driftmark is the seat of House Valyrian, and right here are the stepstones.
I believe the earliest documented histories of Westeros and Essos began somewhere around 12,000 BC. Here, BC means before Aegon's conquest of Westeros. Likewise, AC would mean after Aegon's conquest of Westeros. The first men that we hear so much about actually came from Essos around 12,000 BC and settled in parts of Westeros. Here, they met with the children of the forest, the native beings living in the forest. As is the nature of man, he wanted everything for himself and started massacring the children of the forest, who retaliated, and the war went on for 2,000 years until they reached a pact. But by now, many of the children had been killed, and of course, White Walkers had come into existence by now. You may think that during this time, dragons filled the skies of Essos, or at the very least Valyria, but that's not accurate. Dragons, the boon as well as the bane for Valyria, came into existence much later. Of course, this would be the main focus of the video, but for a more comprehensive understanding, I'll quickly explore a bit of what went around between 10,000 BC and 5,000 BC in Essos. The latter is when the first dragon was recorded in Valyria, so the 2,000 years between 10,000 and 8,000 BC is known as the Age of Heroes. This was a time when fabled heroes like Azor Ahai led the charge on the others, also called White Walkers in Game of Thrones. Azor Ahai wielded the epic sword called Lightbringer and defeated the threat, all without any fire, although blood was spilt. This was also the time when people like Bran the Builder from House Stark built the wall to protect Westeros from what lay beyond in the vastness of the cold desert. Ancient and proud houses like Lannisters and Starks came into existence. The years between the 8th and the 6th millennium BC are quite important, as many developments took place all around the globe. So, by 8,000 BC, the others had been defeated by the first men, and while Westeros licked her wounds after the long night and tried to recover, Essos was developing a new religion, the Faith of the Seven, with the Scepters and Septons and the seven-pointed star and all that. Meanwhile, the Valyrian Freehold had started taking its first steps towards a civilization that would last for several thousand years. Yes, around 8,000 BC, the Valyrians, a sheep-herding people, came together in unity. They didn't prosper much, but they were peaceful and happy herding all the sheep they could find. I'm sure trade was an important part of their livelihood because Essos had always been more mercantile than Westeros. But the nature of trade is such that it also brings greed and hunger for power, and the overarching theme of the books and the show is a hunger for power. So yeah, it mustn't have taken long for the Valyrians to feel threatened by others around them, especially the Gusari people. Naturally, the Valyrians started looking for more and more ways to defend themselves, and you can't expect a tribe of shepherds to pose any significant defense. Needless to say, they eventually found the best form of offense and defense: dragons, the ultimate weapon that would bring to heal both the continents. So, House of the Dragon is all about Targaryens and how dragons shaped who they are, right? The second episode of the first season puts a whole lot of focus on Old Valyria and how the Empire came to an end because of its own devices. King Viserys was probably the only one who really learnt the lessons history had to teach. He was of the opinion that the fall of Valyria was brought about from her people's follies and not because of some natural disaster. But there's more meaning to this than meets the eye. I'll come to it when I talk about the Doom of Valyria later on in the video. The fact that he spends the entire first season to create the scale model of his homeland was to remind the viewers and everyone Viserys' immediate family about their histories. Now, George R.R. Martin doesn't reveal too much about the Doom, but semi-canon sources, certain events, dialogues, and references are enough to piece together a somewhat comprehensive history of Old Valyria. Of course, there could be some degree of speculation, but nothing that could be called over the top. It's pretty much the norm for almost all great nations and city-states to flourish and prosper by walking over other nations. How else would you flourish? How else would you expand? Back in the day when Old Valyria didn't have dragons, they had to contend with the might of the Old Gusari Empire, an empire that was solely built upon the backs of slaves. The Gusari Empire was prepared to annihilate Old Valyria, taking its wealth and enslaving the people, which wouldn't have been difficult since the Valyrians were sheep herders and not dragon lords. However, around 5000 BC, Valyrians discovered dragons in the Ring of Fire around their freehold. Yes, I'm talking about the 14 Flames. After this, they tried to tame the dragons, and the little fledgling nation rose on dragonbacks as a force to be reckoned with. It's beyond a doubt that the Valyrians used blood magic to try and control dragons, and once the Gusari saw the Valyrian dragons, they wanted the dragons for themselves. Naturally, the onslaught on Valyria was immediately escalated. Soon, the two empires were at war and at each other's throats. 5 wars were fought between Old Valyria and Old Gis. Let's take a look. First Gusari War. According to the Gusari written records, the empire was pretty much in its infancy when the Long Night began. This was more or less 8 millennia before the events of House of the Dragon. There were other civilizations as well, such as the forebears of the Kingdom of Sarnor and the realm of the Fisher Queens. But these people didn't keep any written records, or even if they did, such records have been lost to time. On the other hand, Ashai and Yi also claim to have existed since a time before the Long Night, and their records don't go as far back. There's no way to confirm the veracity of these claims. Anyway, let's talk about the war. I've digressed enough. The details of the First War are rather shrouded in mystery, but we can say for sure that Valyrians fought with dragons in this war against the Gusari lockstep legions, forefathers of the Unsullied. These men were considered to be nearly unbeatable in battle, and despite the dragons, Valyrians had a tough time against these men. However, in the end, the strength of the dragons prevailed. The win was a great morale booster for the Valyrians because it was the first time they won against a power like the Gusaris. Second Gusari War. The Kingdom of Sarnor consisted of numerous independent city-states and mostly covered the western plains of the central part of the continent of Essos. To be more specific, the city-states of the Kingdom of Sarnor extended from the northern side of the Painted Mountain. They shared borders with the Gusari in the east and Valyrians in the west. Because of being so close to two opposing parties, the Kingdom of Sarnor was forced to pick a side. Seeing that the Gusari were into slave trade, Sarnor sided with the Valyrians because they both believed in freedom and independence. So the Second Gusari War was fought between the Gusari on the one side and the combined forces of Sarnor and Valyria on the other. Third Gusari War. The third war against the Gusari had the same sides as the second, but by now, Valyrians had become much more equipped with the knowledge of dragons, magic, and warfare. They'd come a long way from a tribe that dealt in sheep and were giving meaning to the term Dragon Lord. When the Third Gusari War took place, the tension between Valyria and Gis had penetrated to the far-flung colonies across the Basilisk Isles, Sothorios, and the Summer Sea. So, the old Empire of Gis had founded this colony called Gorgai, which was located on the Isle of Tears, which was the largest island of the Basilisk Isles archipelago. Gorgai prospered at the cost of slaves for nearly 4 centuries before it was annexed by the good old dragon lords, who renamed it to Gorgossos. It used to be a fairly common trend in many places of the world to rename conquered territories. In fact, this was true for the real-world medieval wars as well. Fourth Gusari War. As I mentioned earlier, the Kingdom of Sarnor was basically a union of city-states, but this union was not as strong as the US. You could compare the Kingdom of Sarnor with the European Union, who act in unison on a few matters and independently on a few other matters. By the Fourth Gusari War, the various Sarnori city-states had allied with both Valyria as well as Gis. Yet it was the Valyrians who won the war, albeit they lost a few battles along the way. Additionally, the Dragon Lords managed to capture Zamatar, the Gusari colony, and the only major city on the coast of Sothorios. Fifth Gusari War. The fifth and final Gusari War took place somewhere in the 47th century BC, nearly 300 years after the Valyrians discovered dragons. After the war was done, the old Gusari Empire was uprooted and thrown like weed. The city was burnt to ashes. The ancient brick wall that Grazdan the Great had once erected was razed. Dragonfire annihilated the Gusari temples and pyramids, so much so that even homes were not spared. To make it worse, they sowed the fertile fields with lime, salt, and skulls to ensure that nothing grew in the region again. In the aftermath, the parts of Gis that were conquered were assimilated into the Valyrian Empire. It was from the Gusari that Valyrians learnt the practice of slavery. Once the dust settled and smog dispersed, only 3 slave cities remained, namely Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor, which were later annexed by Daenerys with the help of her dragons, the Unsullied and able advisors. Coming back to the Valyrians, it's a fact that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power is addictive, and once you get a taste of it, you always want more of it, unless, of course, you're someone as noble terrible as Jon Snow, but then again, he was brought up by Ned Stark at Winterfell. Anyway, after defeating the Gusari, the Valyrian pride was through the roof. Well, that's an understatement. It was through the sky, which they pretty much ruled on their dragons. With no more opponents to defeat, with no more battles to fight and win, the Valyrians were getting bored of the peace brought about by the might of their dragons. Like any self-respecting nation of power-hungry people, they began to test themselves in the vast oceans of opportunity. They started to attack and conquer their neighboring nations and city-states. Before long, most parts of southern Essos was under the control of the Dragon Lords. Naturally, the Valyrian Empire became the most powerful one in all of Essos, by extension, the entire world. Interestingly, they didn't go further to conquer Westeros because they thought it was more backwater region with little to no value. Little did they know that it would become their only home and would house of whatever remained of their people. However, they did take over Dragonstone, which was their westernmost outpost, and it had been given to the Targaryens for maintenance. Now, as Valyria expanded in size, other real-world problems started to surface. The first and foremost of these was the administration and governance of an empire like Valyria. In order to take care of it, the Dragon Lords came up with the idea of a freehold, where the freeborn landowners could voice their opinions. You see, the social distinction was on the basis of people who were born free and as slaves, and not on the basis of noble birth and low birth, as was the case in Westeros. The reason was simple. Westeros did not have slaves. In fact, those that the Valyrians conquered were not considered subjects. They were considered free people and very much a part of the Valyrian society. Having said that, this privilege was not extended to the Gusari, whom the Valyrians enslaved and put to work in the mines of the 14 Flames. Here, the slaves toiled for extended hours to mine gold and other precious minerals. Valyria continued to expand, yes, and with it expanded the need for resources and wealth. Needless to say, the brunt was borne by the Gusari slaves, which resulted in countless deaths. Politically, the most notable of cities around the capital were included in the empire itself, while the others were given the status of trading cities, not directly a part of the Valyrian Empire. You could say that these cities formed the buffer zone around the mainland, and outside this buffer zone was the Valyrian boundary. Now, let's talk about the real source of Valyrian powers. So, one thing about these people was their features. Everyone had the silver-white hair and lilac eyes, which gave them a truly out-of-this-world look. Now, this led the normal people to believe that there was something divine about people with Valyrian blood. They also looked at dragons as godly beasts and believed that the Valyrians were born from dragons. However, this is definitely just a fable, a folktale that could have its roots in the crossbreeding experiments that the Valyrians performed on dragons, fireworms, wyverns, and sometimes also on humans. According to some theories, the Valyrians blended the wyverns with fireworms. The wyverns were basically pterodactyl-like creatures, and the second creature was a fireworm, which is basically a huge fire-breathing worm with small limbs. In the case of regular dragons, the ratio between the two creatures is nearly 2/3 wyvern and 1/3 fireworm. However, in the case of dragons like Caraxes, there's more fireworm than wyvern, hence the elongated shape of Daemon's dragon. In fact, Caraxes is often considered a mutant dragon because of his long neck and super hot flames that he breathes. Naturally, Old Valyria was home to all kinds of magic. Some were extremely forbidden, while the others were sacred. Unfortunately, all this knowledge about magic and the Valyrian culture was lost because of the Doom. In its prime, hundreds of dragons flew the Valyrian skies. In one of the wars that the Dragon Lords fought, they brought 300 dragons along with them. It's impossible that these 300 were all the dragons that they had. Of course, they must have left many back home for protection. Some must have been too young to fly or fight. I'm guessing that they could have had an easy 1,000 dragons in total. With this many dragons, they also had control over blood magic and sorcery, which they used to perform innumerable experiments, some of which were pretty deadly and ruthless. In fact, it was through magic that they manufactured Valyrian steel, which was then used to forge all kinds of weapons, from spears and arrowheads to spears and swords. In today's time, only a handful know how to bend Valyrian steel, and even these people can't possibly create more Valyrian steel, so it's safe to say that the production of Valyrian steel died with Valyria. As far as their religious practices are concerned, they worshipped many gods, and as I just explained, they participated in various magical shit. It was this excessive use of magic and sorcery that presumably caused Valyria's sudden doom. King Viserys once said, "The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion. They're a power man should never have trifled with, one that brought Valyria its doom. If we don't mind our own histories, it will do the same to us." And it made total sense. I mean, let alone dragons. The kind of magic and sorcery that the Valyrians practiced was too much for them to handle. They were playing with forces they didn't fully understand, and playing God has never done anyone any good, ever. Thankfully for the Targaryens, Daenerys the Dreamer foresaw the doom of Valyria in one of her dreams and told her father about it, who sold all his land and properties, collected his family, dragons, and dragon eggs to come to Dragonstone. Although he was considered a coward, he made the wisest decision. Speaking of the whole dream thing that Targaryens have, Daenerys clearly had this power. So did Aegon the Conqueror, who saw the Song of Ice and Fire in his dream. Then we have Helena Targaryen, who also foretells stuff. So this is basically a power that the Targaryens have. Do you think the other Valyrian houses also had powers? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to dreams, but you know, they may have had some different sort of abilities. And do you think all of this happened after the Valyrians discovered dragons? I guess they had such powers from a time before that, and it only enhanced after the arrival of dragons. Food for thought, I believe. And now, let's finally talk about the Doom of Valyria, the most disastrous event in all of Westeros and Essos after the Long Night, or maybe it's on a par with the Long Night. The Doom of Valyria was brought about by a series of volcanic eruptions. While that is true, some believe that it was simply a geological event. However, the widely accepted belief is that the Doom was brought about because the Valyrian dark arts spiraled out of control. You know, like one giant spell gone wrong and a chain reaction started at the 14 flames, which then exacerbated and caused earthquakes and maybe the eruption of other smaller volcanoes. The destruction was of such a magnitude that the Freehold tore itself apart and the sea gushed in. Naturally, other disasters like firestorms, tsunamis, and earthquakes followed. Hot lava flew over land while poisonous fiery smoke filled the air, and it was so deadly that even dragons perished because of the heat. Of course, an event that kills dragons is certainly enough to kill humans and almost other living beings. Valyrian the Black Dread was among the few dragons who survived the Doom because Aenor Targaryen brought him to Dragonstone. The ruins of Valyria are the epitome of a cursed wasteland, left smoldering under a blanket of ash centuries after the Doom obliterated the once great empire. Where the mighty 14 flames used to blaze, now the smoking seas simmer with poison, cloaked in lethal fumes. Rumor has it, Euron Greyjoy was the only soul brave or mad enough to venture into these ruins and live to tell the tale. These days, the desolate landscape serves as a grim sanctuary for those afflicted with greyscale, left to endure their last days far from the healthy world. The fallout from the Doom shook Essos deeply during the period known as the Bleeding Years. The Gusari Empire tried to claw back its former territories but crumbled under its own fragility, causing its colonies to break away and establish the free cities. While the grandeur of Valyrian culture mostly perished with its kingdom, echoes of its legacy linger in the language still spoken by some along Daenerys' path in Game of Thrones, and the influence remains palpable in regions once closely tied to Valyria. In the chaos that followed, vassal states clashed over scraps of power, and the native tribes, the Khalasars, surged in strength. Freed from Valyrian dominion, they raided cities, sparing only those who paid tribute. Old Valyria's splendor remains unmatched, a stark reminder that even those who view themselves as invincible are not immune to downfall. The Dragon Lord's arrogance may have been their undoing, a costly lesson in the balance of power and hubris. Similarly, in the Seven Kingdoms, King Viserys understood that the greatest threat to their reign could be their own overconfidence. Just as greed and the thirst for power doomed Valyria, they now loom as threats to another dynasty of Dragon Lords following Viserys' death. Some Dragon Lords from Lys and Tyrosh managed to survive the Doom, but they didn't last long. Both they and their dragons were soon wiped out. Meanwhile, the Dragon Lord Aurion tried to resurrect Valyria by proclaiming himself Emperor and marched his followers from Qohor back to the Cursed Lands. Neither he nor his followers were ever seen again. The Lure of Valyria also claimed the adventurous Tommen II Lannister, King of the Rock, who vanished on his quest to find the ruins with his sword, Bright Roar. His relative, Geryon Lannister, later met the same fate while searching for the lost blade. This string of disappearances has cemented Valyria's reputation as a place of no return, a fact that even the boldest sailors can't shake off. The secrets lost with Valyria, like the arts of magic, the method to forge Valyrian steel, and volumes of ancient records, are mourned in artworks and songs that permeate cultures across the world. One of the most chilling tales linked to Valyria involves Princess Aeria Targaryen, who vanished from Dragonstone on the dragon Valyrian. When Valyrian returned to King's Landing 2 years later, it brought back a dying Aeria. Septon Barth, who was among those trying to save her, speculated that Valyrian had taken her to its birthplace, Valyria. The horrifying state of her death and the dragon's mysterious injuries were enough for King Jaehaerys I Targaryen to outlaw travel to Valyria under penalty of death and ban ships from the region from docking in Westerosi ports. You see, Valyrian went as the largest dragon alive, but returned from the ruins of Valyria as a kicked dog. Something still remains in Valyria that shouldn't be trifled with. Could it be zombified dragons, or a monstrous result of the experiments that the Valyrians conducted which brought the Doom? I mean, think about it. It's possible that they created a monstrosity so huge and deadly that it messed with the volcanic system when it rose. Valyria remains a haunting legend, a reminder of glory and ruin, wrapped in danger and mystery that continues to captivate and terrify to this day. And that was all in this one. Stay tuned for more marvelous videos. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.